They pulled me out of retirement on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had been fishing. That is what I do now. I fish. I keep a small boat on a lake 200 kilometers from the nearest city, and I go out before the light comes up, and I sit in the cold, and I let the line go slack, and I do not think about anything that matters. I had been doing that for 11 years, 4 months, and somewhere around 16 days when the summons arrived. It came as a physical document, pressed fiber, ink seal, courier delivered, the old way, which told me before I even broke the seal that it was not a routine administrative matter. The diplomatic bureau does not send paper to retired envoys. Not unless the thing they need you for cannot be written on any network that travels faster than light. I read it in the boat. Then I sat there for a while longer with the line in the water, watching the mist come off the surface in thin gray columns, and I thought about the Theocratic Conclave of the Vrethali Quorum. I had not thought about them in a very long time, which had been a deliberate choice on my part. It is a discipline, the not thinking. You practice it the way you practice any other skill, with intention and repetition, until the reflex is clean. Had been practicing for 11 years, and I was good at it by then. I could go whole days without a single thought arriving that smelled of that chamber, that stone, that particular quality of imported silence. The summons broke the discipline in about 4 seconds. I reeled in the line. I motored back to the dock. I did not hurry, because hurrying at that stage would have been a waste, but I did not linger either. Fish were not biting anyway. They rarely were that time of year. They gave me a briefing packet on the transport. I did not read it until we were 3 hours out, because I wanted the first few hours simply to be the fact of being in transit. The mechanical hum, the recycled air, the particular gray-green of a port window, when there is nothing outside it worth looking at. I ate the meal they brought me. I drank the coffee, which was bad but hot. Then I opened the packet. The name Revik San appeared on the 3rd page. I closed the packet again and looked out the window for another 20 minutes. Revik San was the Conclave's archregister. He was the one who had signed the expulsion order 30 years ago. He was the one who had read the formal language into the record. The delegation of the outer terrestrials is hereby rescinded, its standing before this body, its archive entry sealed, its petition history struck from active consideration, in that precise, unhurried voice of his, the voice of a man reading weather reports. He had not looked at us when he read it. He had looked at the wall above our heads, slightly to the left, as though we had already been replaced by something more interesting. I had been 31 years old. It was my first posting as a full envoy. It was also, as it turned out, my last one for the Bureau, though I did not know that yet on the day the Conclave expelled us. I opened the packet again and read the rest. The summary was thin, as summaries always are, when the people writing them do not fully understand what they are summarizing. The core of it was this. 6 weeks ago, a Conclave survey vessel had been operating in the Halathi Corridor, which is a stretch of navigational lanes that runs along what had been, 30 years ago, the approximate boundary of human traffic in that region. The survey vessel had been conducting what the packet called a routine hydrographic census, which is the kind of work you assign to vessels and crews that you are not particularly worried about. Routine, hydrographic, census. They had found our ships, not 1 or 2, not a patrol or a freighter. The survey vessel's sensor array had resolved, over the course of about 4 hours, the presence of 219 distinct vessel signatures in the corridor and its adjacent lanes. The signatures were moving at varying speeds on coordinated headings. A portion of them were very large. The smallest were still larger than anything the Conclave had logged against humanity's name in its records. It was the detail that the packet's author seemed most unable to account for. The survey vessel had queried the Conclave's central registry for vessel classifications. The registry had returned. No match. Archive entry sealed. Refer to expulsion record 7741 Vreth. The survey vessel had sent a second query assuming a data error. The registry had returned the same thing. Then, according to the packet, the survey vessel's captain had sent a personal communication to the Archregister's office directly, bypassing the automated system entirely, which is the kind of thing that gets a captain in serious trouble with an institution like the Vrethali. quorum unless the thing she is reporting justifies it absolutely. The captain's name was Drant, and the communication she sent was 11 words long. I read those 11 words twice. Then I understood why they had sent paper. The transport made good time. I arrived at the Diplomatic Bureau's regional station at the 19th hour, and was met by a man named Corvin Brast, who had the title of Deputy Coordinator for Outer Reach Liaison, which meant he was responsible for exactly the situations that were not supposed to exist anymore. He was young. He had the kind of face that is trying very hard to appear calm and not quite managing it around the edges. He shook my hand with both of his, which told me he had read my file and was overcompensating. "Envoy Holt," he said. "Thank you for coming." I told him I preferred just Holt now, since I was not currently an envoy. He said they were hoping to change that temporarily and asked if I would follow him. I followed him. The bureau station was not large, but it was busy, which surprised me. I had expected a skeleton crew. Instead, there were people at every console, people in the corridors talking in low, urgent voices, people carrying documents the same pressed fiber way the summons had been carried to me. The no-network policy was clearly in full effect, which meant someone senior had decided that the standard communication infrastructure could not be trusted for this. That was a significant decision. It added cost and complexity and a delay to everything. People only make that decision when the alternative is worse. Brass brought me to a room with a long table and several chairs. There were 4 other people already seated. I recognized 2 of them. Ambassador retired Fen Caloris, who had been the senior envoy on that last mission 30 years ago, and was now, I knew, running a consultancy somewhere in the inner systems, and General retired Pask Dunmore, who had been the military attaché. The other 2 were younger, working age, active service faces, and they introduced themselves as Analyst Theos and Senior Translator Ve Moral. Caloris looked at me the way old soldiers look at each other when the thing they were both trying to forget has come back. "You read the packet," he said. I read it, the 11 words, yes, he nodded. He had been the one 30 years ago, kept his face completely still when the Archregistrar read the expulsion order. Completely still, not performing stillness, actually still. I had watched him from the corner of my eye and tried to learn from it. I was not sure I had succeeded, but I had tried. "We need to go back," he said. "They've requested it, formally, through the same courier protocol they used for the expulsion, the old quorum seal, the old language. They want a delegation seated before the conclave within 40 days. I asked who would lead it. He said he could not, his health. He said it without elaboration, and I did not press him. The slight downward pull at the left side of his face told me the rest. Dunmore said he would serve as attaché again if they needed him, which they did. That left the senior envoy position. I looked at the table for a moment. It was the same kind of long composite table they used in bureau rooms everywhere. Gray-green surface, matte finish, a slight ridge around the perimeter. I had sat at tables like this for most of my adult life, in rooms like this, with people like these, talking about things like this. And then I had stopped deliberately and carefully and gone to a lake. I said yes. They briefed me for 3 days. The picture that assembled itself out of that briefing was not the picture the packet had suggested. The packet had described a surprise. Vessels where none should be, registry confusion, a captain's 11-word message. The briefing described something longer and quieter, and considerably more deliberate. It described 30 years of work, most of it conducted by people who had never expected to set foot inside a conclave chamber again, and had, on the whole, decided that was fine. I had been one of those people for 11 years. The others had been at it for 30. The distinction mattered, and I sat with it during the briefing sessions. The awareness that my own absence had been a form of disengagement, that the people who had continued, the work had not permitted themselves. Caloris, from his consultancy, had remained involved at the strategic level, which was the level he had always operated at, and which, I suspected, he had never been capable of fully abandoning. Dunmore had stayed connected through the military frameworks that overlapped with the Compact's mutual security arrangements. Even the people I did not know, the analysts and coordinators, and the hundreds of working-level staff who had built the lane infrastructure over 2 decades, had understood themselves as part of an ongoing project, not a concluded one. I was the outlier. I was the one who had gone to a lake. When the conclave had expelled our delegation, they had been responding to what they understood as a pattern of intransigence. Humanity had been, in their assessment, a nuisance applicant. A young civilization presenting itself at the gate of a very old institution, requesting standing and recognition, lacking the fleet density, the territorial claims, and the diplomatic history that the quorum treated as prerequisites for serious consideration. They had tolerated our presence at the outer sessions for 6 years. Then, at the conclusion of a particularly contentious negotiation over navigational rights in the Halathi corridor, they had voted to end it. The vote had been 43-2. Our petition history was struck. Our archive entry was sealed. We were invited, in the formal language of the expulsion order, to address our developmental deficiencies before seeking readmission. What the conclave had not understood, what they had, apparently, not considered worth understanding, was what humanity would do with 30 years, and a closed door. The briefing documents covered it in sections, and I read each section carefully. We had not, as the conclave had presumably expected, retreated to our core systems and continued our slow development along lines they had judged insufficient. We had instead redirected. The energy that had gone into the petition process, the lobbying, the presentations, the careful cultivation of minor quorum members, all the slow institutional work of trying to be admitted through the front gate, that energy had gone elsewhere, into shipbuilding, into the deep lane infrastructure along the Halathi corridor and its tributaries, into the outer compact, which was the nurturing and defense arrangement we had assembled with 11 other civilizations that the conclave had similarly excluded or marginalized over the years. Into the archive of the expelled, which was the name our historians had given to the collection of records, navigational surveys, and treaty frameworks the compact's member civilizations had built together during the 30 years the conclave had not been watching. There was a particular detail in the briefing annex that the analyst had flagged with a note in the margin. Several of the lanes forming the core of the compact's navigational infrastructure ran through corridor space that the Vrethali Quorum had historically treated as within their sphere of navigational authority, not claimed outright, not sovereign in the formal sense, but subject to the conclave's registry and traffic management systems. For 30 years, the compact had been running freight through those lanes, building way station infrastructure on the margins, establishing the kind of long-term physical presence that, under the navigational law frameworks the quorum itself had authored, constituted the beginning of a recognized usage claim. The conclave had not noticed, because the conclave had sealed our archive entry and stopped paying attention. That is what they do with civilizations they consider resolved. They close the file and move on. The annex did not use the word resolved, but I understood what it was describing. The 219 vessels in the corridor were not a demonstration. They had not been assembled for the survey captain's benefit. They were just there because that was where our traffic ran now. That was what 30 years of redirected work looked like when you took a census of it. The survey captain's 11 words had been, "The archive says these ships don't exist. I'm looking right at them." On the 40th day, presented ourselves at the conclave's outer reception hall. There were 3 of us. Myself, General Dunmore, and a young woman named Sarah Van who had served as our lead trade analyst for the Halathi Compact negotiations, and who, at 32, was already one of the better diplomatic minds I had encountered. I had chosen her, specifically, because she was young enough that the conclave would underestimate her, and because she had the particular quality I valued most in a chamber like that one, she understood silence. Not the performed kind, not the dramatic kind, the genuine kind, the silence of a person who has said what needs to be said and is content to let it sit there. The outer reception hall was a large room faced in pale stone, a high vaulted ceiling and windows, cut so deep into the walls that the light arrived in long angles, heavy and deliberate, as though the architecture itself disapproved of haste. I had been in this room 6 times over the course of the original mission, years ago. It looked the same. This was not a surprise. The Vrethali Quorum had been building in this style for approximately 400 years, and they were not an institution that renovated. A conclave functionary met us. She was young by Vrethali standards, which meant she was probably 60 or 70 years into her formal service. She wore the gray and silver sash of an intake coordinator, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who has learned to transmit nothing, her body that she has not decided to transmit. She asked for our credentials. Dunmore presented them, the original expulsion seal, the counter seal from the Bureau, and the new credentials issued under the Bureau's outer reach authority. Functionary ultimate examined them with a small handheld scanner and said nothing for long enough that I began to wonder if she was going to raise an objection. Then she said, "The conclave will receive you in the main chamber at the second hour of the afternoon session." We were shown to a waiting room. It was, I noted, the same waiting room they had used for our delegation 30 years ago. Whether this was intentional or simply a matter of protocol, I could not determine. I found myself looking at the bench along the left wall, the same pale stone, the same slight unevenness in the seat, and remembering sitting there before my first session, young and tightly wound, and full of the specific nervous energy of someone who still believed that preparation would be enough. I sat down on it again. Dunmore sat beside me. Siravan looked at the room for a moment, then sat across from us and opened her documents. "They'll have read the survey report," she said, not looking up. "Yes. And the registry query logs." "Yes. So they know the archive is wrong." I said, "Yes, they know the archive is wrong." She turned a page. "How wrong is it?" I thought about that. The briefing documents had included an annex, a comparative summary prepared by one of the Bureau's analysts, setting the conclave's sealed archive entry for humanity against the current situation as it actually existed. The archive entry, which had been sealed 30 years ago, and apparently not updated since, described a civilization of modest fleet capacity, limited deep lane infrastructure, no significant territorial arrangements beyond the home system, and a diplomatic footprint assessed as nascent and insufficient for full standing. Current situation described 219 vessels in one corridor alone, a compact of 12 civilizations, navigational infrastructure running through roughly a third of the outer lanes that the conclave considered its sphere of influence, and treaty arrangements that, depending on how you read the relevant clauses, extended certain mutual defense obligations across a substantial portion of what the conclave had been treating as uncontested space. The archive was not slightly wrong. The archive was 30 years out of date in every dimension that mattered. I told Saravan, "Very wrong." She nodded and kept reading. The second hour of the afternoon session arrived. The functionary returned and led us through the inner corridor to the chamber doors. They were the same doors, pale stone architrave, conclave sigil inlaid in black and silver, the faint smell of the polishing compound they used on the hinges, which I had last smelled 30 years ago, and which my memory had apparently preserved with perfect fidelity. Smell is like that. It does not decay the way visual memory does. It waits in you, clean and exact, until the thing it was attached to comes back. The doors opened. The conclave's main chamber is a large oval room with tiered seating on 3 sides, and the quorum table at the far end. The table is long and dark, a deep purple-black stone that the Vrethali quarry somewhere I have never been, and the quorum members are seated behind it in order of seniority, with the arch-registrar at the center. There is a standing position for petitioners at the near end of the chamber, separated from the table by perhaps 20 meters of open floor. The floor is pale stone, the same as everything else, and your footsteps carry in it. I had walked that floor before. I walked it again. The chamber was full. I had not expected that. The outer sessions we had attended years ago had been sparsely attended. Minor matter, Soap's minor civilization, the back benches largely empty. Today every tier was occupied. I could feel it before I looked. The weight of that many bodies in a space calibrated for a different kind of transaction. I kept my eyes forward and my pace even, and I did not count them, because counting would have meant acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would have suggested they were relevant in a way I was not prepared to concede yet. Arch-Registrar Revik San was still alive. I had known this from the briefing materials, but knowing it abstractly and seeing it in a specific chair 20 meters away are different things. He was old now. The Vrethali age along lines that are not quite parallel to human aging, becoming more angular and deliberate as the decades pass, rather than more drawn and diminished. And he wore the full regalia of his office, which he had not worn at the expulsion session 30 years ago. The full regalia meant this was a formal matter of the highest order. The empty seat at the expulsion had meant we were not worth the formality. I stood at the petitioner's position. Dunmore stood at my right. Sarah Van stood at my left. The arch-registrar looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in the formal opening language of the Conclave's records, the delegation of the Outer Terrestrial Compact is recognized before this body. The session is opened. I noted the name. Not the delegation of the Outer Terrestrials, which was the language of the expulsion order. The Outer Terrestrial Compact. They had done their reading, he went on. He gave the formal recitation of the session's purpose, which was the conclave's standard opening procedure regardless of circumstances, and which I had heard enough times to know the rhythm of it. While he spoke, I looked at the quorum table. There were 14 members seated. 3 of them I recognized from 30 years ago. San himself, 2 others on the outer wings of the table, older now in the same angular way. The rest were new to me. Among the new ones, I counted at least 3 who were visibly not comfortable. Not panicked. The Vrethali are far too disciplined for visible panic in a formal session, carrying the particular quality of stillness. That is not composure, but its approximation. The approximation you use when the genuine article is not available. San finished the formal recitation. He set down the document he had been reading from. He looked at me again. The Conclave's registry office has produced a discrepancy report, he said. You will be aware of its contents. I said yes. The report identifies a substantial divergence between the Conclave's current archive entry for your civilization and the situation observed by our survey vessel in the Halathi corridor 6 weeks prior. I said yes again. Conclave requests your assistance in understanding the nature and extent of this divergence. It was a careful word, requests. It was the word of an institution that had not previously been in the habit of requesting things from us, and was now choosing it deliberately, reasons that were clear enough without being stated. I let the words sit in the room for a moment. Not a dramatic pause, just time enough for everyone present to have heard it fully. Then I said, we're happy to assist. Someone on the upper tier made a sound. I did not look up to identify the source. It was not a loud sound, not a gasp, not an exclamation. It was the small involuntary noise that a body makes when it has just processed an unexpected calibration of tone. The arch-registrar's expression did not change. He was very good. He had been doing this for a long time. The archive entry sealed at the time of your delegation's expulsion describes your civilization's fleet capacity as. He consulted the document for him. Modest, with deep lane reach assessed as limited to home system adjacency and selected near outer corridors. I said yes. That is what the entry says. Our survey vessel cataloged 219 vessel signatures in the Halathi corridor. I said yes, the smallest of which exceeds your archive classification by, he paused again, consulting. A substantial margin. I said yes. He looked up from the document. The archive is wrong, I said. The archive is 30 years old. The chamber was quiet enough after that to hear the ventilation. San placed both hands flat on the table. It was a small gesture, contained, but on a man of his discipline it was a gesture, which meant it was deliberate. He said, the conclave would find it useful to understand what occurred during the period of your delegation's absence. I had thought carefully about how to answer this question. Not in the 3 days of briefings, though I had thought about it then too, but in the 40 days between the summons and this session, and in the 11 years before that when I had not been thinking about it. You do not think about a problem by going over it and over it, but by leaving it alone long enough for the shape of it to settle. The shape of it was simple. What had occurred was not a secret, and it was not a complicated story. It was simply 30 years of work that the conclave had not been watching, because they had decided, 43-2, that we were not worth watching. I said, we built things. Another sound from the upper tier, closer to the center this time. Stan's hands did not move. I said, "We took the energy we had been putting into this process and we directed it elsewhere. We built ships, built lanes. We found 11 other civilizations who had been in similar situations, excluded, marginalized, told to address their developmental deficiencies. And we built arrangements with them. Trade arrangements, navigational arrangements, certain mutual commitments regarding security. We have been doing that for 30 years. The archive you sealed 30 years ago describes a civilization in the early stages of that process. We are no longer in the early stages." The arch-registrar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The compact, yes. 12 civilizations, yes. Navigational infrastructure in the outer Halathi and tributary lanes, yes." He looked at the document again, though I suspected he had already memorized it. "The survey vessel's report indicates vessel signatures consistent with long-haul freight, figuration, recurring patterns suggesting established route structures. Yes. You have been running traffic through the Halathi corridor, yes." "How long?" I said. "For about 22 years at significant volume. Before that, for the 8 years prior to that, at lower volume while the infrastructure was being built." He was quiet again. I waited. One of the other quorum members, a woman seated 3 positions to San's right, whom I did not recognize, who had the bearing of someone in a senior administrative role, leaned slightly forward and said, "The corridor has been a contested navigational area under conclave jurisdiction for 2 centuries. I looked at her. I said, "Yes, we were aware of that," she said. "And yet," I said, "and yet," she sat back. "I want to be precise about what happened in the silence that followed, because it is easy to describe it incorrectly. It is easy to describe it as a moment of triumph or humiliation, as though the conclave had been defeated and we had won something. That is not what it was. What it was recognition. A very old institution, very good procedures, and very long memory was in the process of revising its assessment of a situation it had miscategorized 30 years ago. That process was not comfortable for them. It was not meant to be comfortable, but it was not theater, and it was not victory. It was the necessary adjustment of a record that had been wrong, being made slowly, and at some cost, by people who had spent their careers inside an institution built on the principle that the record was never wrong. The arch-registrar said, "Conclave will require time to prepare an updated assessment." I said, "Of course. We anticipate a full review of the archive entry. The current entry will be marked provisional pending the review's completion." I said we understood. "Compact's member civilizations, will their delegations be presenting credentials separately, or," I said, "separately in their own time, as they chose to?" We were not here to speak for them. We were here to speak for the outer terrestrial compact as a body, and for our own civilization directly. The other members would manage their own approaches. He absorbed this. There was a brief exchange among the quorum members, not spoken aloud but visible in the small movements of heads and hands that people use in chambers, when they have decided that something needs to be communicated, but the record should not carry it. I had seen it happen in enough sessions to recognize it for what it was. Fast, silent recalculation of people who have just discovered that the situation is larger than the document they prepared for. San said, "The conclave notes that the compact's membership constitutes a substantial number of civilizations with whom this body has not had active diplomatic relations," I said. 11 in addition to ourselves, several of whom had petitions before this body at various points. Several of them, yes. And those petitions were declined, I said. In most cases sealed. He said nothing for a moment then. "And those civilizations are now members of the compact." I said yes. He said nothing more on that point. "I want to say something about Revik San. I am aware that it is easy, at this distance, to describe what happened in that chamber in terms that flatten him, to make him a representative of an institution's error, a figure of comeuppance, the person at the end of a 30-year account being settled. That is not how I experienced it sitting in that room, and it is not how I experience it now, looking back from further still. He was a man who had done his job for a very long time according to a set of procedures and assessments that had in this instance been wrong. He could not have known they were wrong at the time. Or at least, he could not have known the degree to which they would become wrong, because no one sits across from a nascent civilization and measures with precision what 30 years of redirected effort will produce. The error was real. The consequences were real. But the man sitting 20 meters away from me was not a villain. He was an administrator who had signed a document that, at the time, his institution considered unremarkable, and who was now sitting inside the unremarkable document's consequences. I did not feel contempt for him. I felt something closer to the specific tiredness that comes from being on the winning side of a very long patience. Session continued for another hour. Much of it was procedural. The formal steps required by conclave law for the opening of a review, the scheduling of follow-on sessions, the establishment of a liaison framework between our delegation and the conclave's registry office. Sarah Van handled most of this. I had not asked her to. She simply moved into it with the quiet competence of someone who has been preparing for exactly this work and does not need direction to begin it. I watched her and thought, yes, she will be good at this for a long time. Dunmore stood beside me throughout and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. He had the particular quality of presence that experienced military people develop when they have learned that the most powerful thing they can contribute to a diplomatic session is their own solidity, the implication, transmitted through posture and silence, that the things behind the delegation are real and need not be described. Near the end of the session, one of the younger quorum members, a man on the far left of the table, perhaps 40 years into his service, which made him relatively junior by conclave's standards, asked a question that was not in the procedural record. He addressed it to me directly, bypassing the formal address structure that the session was supposed to observe. He said, "When the expulsion was issued, were you expecting to return?" It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one. I could hear it in the way he asked it. The specific curiosity of a person who is trying to understand how something happened and has decided that correct path to understanding through the person who was there. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Not specifically. We knew we would build what we needed to build. What we would do with it afterward, we left that open." He said, "You left it open." I said, "The door was closed. We built other things. When the door opened again, we came back." He was quiet. The session was closed by the archregistrar with the formal language. We stood through the closing recitation, takes approximately 4 minutes in its full form, and then the quorum members rose in order of seniority and departed through the door behind the table, and the gallery tier cleared in the careful, unhurried way of people who know that their institution expects a certain quality of exit. We were escorted back to the outer reception hall. The functionary who had met us that morning was waiting. She asked if our accommodation arrangements were satisfactory and whether we required anything before the next scheduled session. Sarah Van answered her. I stood by one of the deep-cut windows and looked at the light coming in at its long oblique angle and thought about what had just happened. What had just happened was not the end of anything. It was not the resolution of 30 years. The review would take time. The archive update would be contested in procedural terms. The follow-on sessions would be careful and slow and would involve a great deal of the kind of language that does the work of saying difficult things without the record appearing to say them directly. There was a great deal still to be done. But the session had established the basic fact. The basic fact was this: the conclave had sealed our archive entry 30 years ago on the basis of an assessment that was no longer accurate by any measure. The archive entry was provisional now. The word provisional in conclave legal language does not mean uncertain. It means under active revision, which means wrong until proven otherwise, which means the institution has accepted, formally, that it needs to correct its record. That was not a small thing. Sarah Van finished with the functionary and came to stand beside me at the window. She said, "The liaison framework they agreed to, it's broader than I expected. They included the subsidiary corridor lanes in the scope." I said, "Yes, that means they're acknowledging compact infrastructure in areas they haven't formally recognized before." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "How long will the full review take?" I said. "Probably 3 years, maybe 4. The conclave does not move quickly, and this is a review that touches a great many entries, not just ours, she said. The other compact members, I said, they know. They have been waiting too. We had spoken with all of them before coming here. She nodded. She looked out the window at the pale sky above the conclave's stone courtyard. She said, I keep thinking about the survey captain. I said yes. 11 words. I said yes. That's the whole story, isn't it? From her point of view, I thought about it. From Captain Drant's point of view, it was a normal survey run, in a lane she probably considered unremarkable. She had queried the registry for help identifying what she was seeing. The registry had told her the ships didn't exist. She had looked out the window and written down what was actually there, 11 words, and sent it to the Arch-Register's personal office because the registry was clearly broken. I said, from her point of view, the archive was wrong and someone needed to know. That's all. That's all. I found I had nothing to add to it. We were shown to our accommodation in the conclave's guest wing, which was the same wing they had housed us in 30 years ago. I do not know if this was deliberate. It may have been. The Vrethali have long memories and a deliberate approach to symmetry. The room I was given was small and pale and correct in every detail that a guest room requires, and the window faced the same courtyard I had looked out at when I was 31 years old, tightly wound, full of the specific nervous energies of someone who still believed that preparation would be enough. I stood at the window for a while. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I was tired in the deep way you get tired when you have been carrying a weight for a very long time and someone has finally agreed to help you set it down. Not all the way down, not yet, not for years, but the agreement was in place. The record was provisional. The correction had begun. I thought about the lake, the mist coming off the surface in thin columns, the line going slack. Thought, not yet. There was still work to do. Dunmore knocked on my door an hour later and asked if I wanted to eat. I said yes. We ate in the guest wing's common room, which was as quiet and pale as everything else in the conclave's buildings, and we did not talk about the session. We talked about other things, his grandchildren, my fishing, piece of news from the inner systems that had nothing to do with any of this. And we ate the food that the conclave staff brought, which was good in the way that very old institutions' food is good, consistent and careful, and slightly too formal for a common room. After dinner, I went back to my room and I wrote 2 documents. One was the session record, the formal summary that would go to the Bureau, covering the procedural outcomes and the specific commitments the conclave had made, in the language that the Bureau would need to process it correctly. This took about an hour. The second document was shorter. It was not a formal document. It was the kind of thing you write for yourself to put the shape of a thing into words before the shape of it shifts, the way it always does when time passes and the memory starts to adjust itself toward the version that makes the most sense in retrospect, rather than the version that was actually there. I wrote down what the room had looked like, the angle of the light, the Arch-Register's hands on the table, the sound from the upper tier that was not quite a sound, the word requests, and the small careful silence I had given it before answering, the junior quorum member's question, were you expecting to return, and the answer which I had given simply because it was true. The door was closed. We built other things. When the door opened again, we came back. I read it back. It was a plain account. It did not have the shape of a victory because it was not a victory. It was the beginning of a long correction that would take years and would require patience and care, and the specific kind of attention that you give to things that matter and cannot be rushed. But it had the shape of something real, which is all I have ever asked of the accounts I keep. I filed the session record and set the personal account aside. Then I turned off the light and lay there in the dark of the conclave's guest room, in the same building where I had been 31 years old and wrong about what preparation could do, and I thought about 30 years of work and what it looks like when you take a census of it. It looks like 219 vessels in a corridor. It looks like a registry that cannot match what it is seeing because the last entry is 30 years out of date. It looks like a survey captain writing 11 words because the system's record and the physical world have come apart, and someone has to say so. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is for people who were not sure it would work. We had been sure, in the slow, stubborn way of people who simply did not consider the alternative and so kept building. What I felt was something more like the weight of a very long patience, settling at last into its final shape. It had taken 30 years. That is how long it takes, sometimes, for the record to be corrected. You close the door. The work continues. The work does not care about the door. And one day, a survey captain sits in a corridor she expected to be empty, and she looks at what is actually there, and she writes it down. That is the whole story.